Humanity's final warning. The storm gathers. The echoes of humanity's triumphs in the cosmos were still fresh, a bright testament to its endless ambition. The colonies of Earth had thrived on distant worlds, stretching from the scorching deserts of Mars to the frozen ice plains of Europa. Humanity had transcended the boundaries of its cradle, casting its mark across the stars. New cities grew under alien skies, satellites orbiting worlds once thought too hostile for life. And the message was clear: humanity was destined for greatness. Yet, as the human race marched ever forward, fueled by the unyielding spirit of discovery, a new shadow had appeared in the vast, uncharted territories beyond the Pleiades cluster. This was not the result of cosmic misfortune or a natural disaster. This was the arrival of a new enemy, the Gaithers. An ancient, war-hardened race from the darkest corners of the galaxy, the Gaithers had not only survived their turbulent history, but thrived in it. They were known throughout the universe, not for their kindness or mercy, but for their ruthlessness and cold, calculating nature. Their empire, spanning countless star systems, was built on conquest and assimilation, with no respect for the cultures they trampled beneath their feet. When their warships entered the star system of New Haven, a vibrant human colony at the edge of known space, the people of Earth felt a ripple in the fabric of their cosmic dreams. The Gaithers attacked without warning, using a brutal and efficient method that left no time for the inhabitants to react. The once thriving colony was reduced to a burning ruin in the blink of an eye, its cries for mercy swallowed by the cold void of space. The fleet of New Haven stood no chance, its defensive systems powerless against the Gaither onslaught. Across the galaxy, the news of New Haven's destruction spread like wildfire. To the human colonies, it was more than just an attack. It was an affront to everything humanity stood for. The United Earth government, which had once only worried about colonizing new planets and forging alliances, now found itself thrust into a conflict unlike any it had ever imagined. In the wake of the attack, the president of the United Earth, a seasoned leader named Evelyn Carson, stood before a solemn assembly of representatives from every colony and space station. Her face, typically calm and collected, was set with an expression of fierce determination. The images of New Haven, its towering buildings crumbling and its people fighting desperately for survival, were etched into her mind, as though they had been burned there by the very stars. The declaration she made in that assembly would be heard across the galaxy, reverberating through every human settlement, every outpost. She spoke, not just as a leader of a nation, but as the voice of a species that had endured hardship and survived. "We are coming for you," she said, her voice unwavering, as if the words themselves were a beacon of defiance. "No longer will we sit idle while our people are slaughtered. This is not just a call to arms. It is a declaration of who we are. We fight not only for New Haven, but for every colony, every dream, every person who dares to call this galaxy home." The room fell silent. The words had hit hard, like a strike against the chest. Every representative, from the farthest reaches of the human frontier to the heart of Earth's most powerful cities, understood the gravity of what was being asked of them. There was no turning back now. Humanity had been pushed to the brink, and in that moment, it would either break or rally together. Admiral Lucas Winters, a man who had served in countless border skirmishes, now stood at the forefront of the United Earth's military effort. His experience and tactical brilliance were renowned across the fleet, and it was he who had been chosen to lead the charge against the Gaithers. Winters was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice commanded attention. He addressed his crew in a way that only he could, his presence a testament to the weight of what was about to unfold. "This is not about vengeance," Winters said, his tone steady, unwavering. "This is about justice. The people of New Haven, and all those who stand with us, deserve more than to be forgotten in the void. We carry with us the hopes and dreams of all humanity. We will not falter." The fleet that gathered under his command was an imposing sight. Ships of all sizes, some old and battered, others newly constructed with the latest human technology, formed a vast armada that stretched across the darkness of space. They were not merely vessels of war, they were symbols of human resilience. Every ship, every crew member, every soldier had one singular goal: to ensure that the Gaithers would never again threaten the peace and freedom of the human race. On Earth and across the colonies, the call to arms had been heard. In every corner of the galaxy, ordinary people who had once never imagined themselves as soldiers now donned uniforms, trained tirelessly, and prepared for a conflict that would change the course of history. The factories of Earth hummed day and night, churning out weapons, ammunition, and ships to fuel the impending war. Humanity had always been inventive, but now that ingenuity would be put to the ultimate test, the tension across the colonies was palpable. In the crowded streets of New Tokyo, on the icy plains of Europa, and in the dust-filled atmosphere of Mars, people gathered to watch the unfolding events. News reports, broadcasts, and live feeds brought the devastation of New Haven into every home, every workplace, every school. In the face of tragedy, humanity had only one response: unity. As the fleet prepared to enter the Gaither-controlled territories, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The moment of reckoning had arrived. But as they journeyed further into enemy space, the question loomed large: would humanity's courage and unity be enough to face a foe as ancient and powerful as the Gaithers? There was no way to know for sure, but one thing was certain: Earth's final warning had been issued. The storm was coming, and humanity was ready to face it, no matter the cost. The Gaithers' wrath, in the shadows of war. The Gaither Empire had lived in the shadows for millennia, their motives and actions wrapped in mystery. For centuries, their dominance over vast swaths of the galaxy had been absolute. Few knew of the true horrors that lay behind their iron curtain of secrecy. The humans, for all their advancements, had underestimated their enemy, believing that sheer willpower and technological prowess would be enough to secure their future among the stars. But in the cold depths of space, that belief was about to be tested. As the United Earth Fleet surged toward the heart of Gaither-controlled space, Admiral Lucas Winters stood on the bridge of the flagship Eclipse, staring at the star map that glowed before him. The red markers that signified enemy territories were scattered across the map like bloodstains, each one representing a conquest, a world erased, a civilization wiped from existence. His hand gripped the armrest of his chair, knuckles white, as he studied the coordinates of their first strike. "We're not just fighting to survive," Winters muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're fighting for the very soul of humanity." The words weighed heavily on his shoulders. The task before him wasn't just a military mission. It was the last stand of a race that had reached for the stars, and now faced the possibility of extinction. The fleet was vast, but its numbers were not infinite. The Gaithers, with their advanced technology and brutal tactics, had an advantage. Yet, Winters knew something that the Gaithers didn't. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its resilience, its ability to adapt and fight back when all seemed lost. They had done it before, and they would do it again. As the fleet approached the first of many Gaither colonies, the atmosphere was tense. Every crew member knew what was at stake. Communications had been cut off from the rest of the galaxy, leaving them in the dark about the true scale of the Gaithers' military might. All they had was their training, their courage, and each other. The eclipse broke through the outer layers of the enemy's space, and the silence was broken by the sudden blare of alarms. The Gaithers had detected their presence. No time for subtlety now. The Gaither fleet, though vast, had a cruel, streamlined efficiency to it. It was not built to wage war in the way humans understood. It was built to annihilate, swiftly, without mercy. Enemy ships on the radar. "Sir," the communications officer shouted, pointing at the approaching mass of warships. "They're closing in fast. They're not wasting any time." A series of dark, angular vessels materialized before them on the holoscreen. Gaither warships. Their black hulls glinted in the cold light of distant stars, their sleek forms designed for maximum lethality. The sheer presence of the ships exuded a terrifying calm, as if the Gaithers knew they were invincible. "Prepare for engagement," Winters ordered, his voice cold and precise. "This is what we came here for. Engage the enemy with everything we've got." The battle began in an instant, the fleet opening fire with everything they had. Bright, explosive streaks of energy lit up the void as the human ships unleashed their weapons. Laser cannons, torpedoes, and missile volleys ripped through the emptiness, slamming into the Gaither ships, but the results were chilling. The Gaithers responded with terrifying precision, their ships effortlessly dodging incoming fire with their hyper-advanced maneuvering systems. Humanity's weapons hit, but they did little more than scratch the surface of the Gaither fleet. "Sir," a crew member cried out in disbelief, "their shields are intact. How are we supposed to?" Before the officer could finish his sentence, the Eclipse lurched as an explosion rocked the ship. The bridge was thrown into chaos. Sparks flew from the control panels, and the lights flickered. The magnitude of the Gaither counterattack was unlike anything the human fleet had encountered before. "Hold together," Winters barked, grabbing the armrest of his chair to steady himself. "Return fire. Adjust targeting to their weak points. We can't let them get the upper hand." As the battle raged, the human fleet found itself locked in a struggle that seemed increasingly futile. The Gaither ships moved with unnatural precision, almost as if they anticipated every move humanity made. They tore through human defenses, ship after ship falling to their relentless assault. The cold, mechanical nature of their attacks was a stark contrast to the humanity fighting in space, people who had everything to lose. The Eclipse was taking heavy damage, its systems buckling under the strain. An emergency alarm blared across the bridge as the main engine room reported a catastrophic failure. The crew scrambled to compensate, but it was clear that the tide was turning. The humans, despite their bravery, were being overwhelmed. Yet, in the midst of chaos, something unexpected happened. The lead Gaither flagship, Astraeon, an enormous vessel, as dark as the void itself, halted its assault. It hung in space for a moment, as if watching the destruction unfold. Then, without warning, a single message was broadcasted to all human ships, transmitted across every frequency. The message was chilling, cold, and calculating, in a language humans had never heard before. But its meaning was unmistakable. "We know you, human. We know your kind. You are fragile, but you are also strong. You will fight until you break, and then you will beg for mercy. But there will be no mercy." The word hung in the air, a final declaration before the enemy unleashed its full wrath. As the Eclipse continued to fight valiantly, and humanity's struggle seemed hopeless, a voice broke through the madness, an unexpected beacon of hope. Lieutenant Area Hall, a young officer with a reputation for unorthodox tactics, tapped her communicator in the midst of battle. "Admiral Winters," she said, her voice steady amidst the noise of combat. "I have an idea. We may still have a chance." Winters turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What is it, Lieutenant?" "There's a Gaither weakness," she replied. "It's subtle, but it's there. Their systems rely heavily on synchronized communication between their ships. If we can disrupt their networks, even for a moment, we may have a chance to break their formation." Winters stared at her, trying to process the idea. It was risky, unproven, but with their backs against the wall, what choice did they have? Do it. Now. As Lieutenant Hall set her plan into motion, an unexpected twist began to take shape. The Gaither fleet, overconfident in their superiority, had overlooked a simple vulnerability. It was time for humanity to show its true colors. The heart of the storm, humanity strikes back. The void of space was eerily silent, punctuated only by the sounds of the battle, a cacophony of weapons fire, and the groaning of starships in the throes of destruction. The Eclipse hung in the balance, battered but not broken, its crew doing everything in their power to keep the ship in operation. The Gaither fleet, relentless and calculating, pressed forward with cold efficiency. Their ships moved like shadows in the darkness, impervious to the fury the humans unleashed in desperate retaliation. But amid the destruction, one glimmer of hope remained: Lieutenant Area Hall's plan. As the Eclipse continued to fire on the Gaither flagship, Hall and her team worked feverishly at their terminals, scanning for any signs of a weak point in the enemy's vast and enigmatic communication network. If she could disrupt their synchronization, it would send ripples through the Gaither fleet, giving humanity a chance to shift the balance of power. "We found it." Hall's voice rang out, clear amidst the chaos. "There's a gap, an anomaly in their communications relay system. It's in the rear of their fleet, where their flagship is positioned. If we can hit it with a focused EMP strike, we might be able to disrupt their entire system." Admiral Winter's eyes widened as he listened. He understood the gamble they were about to take. The Gaither ships were too close, too powerful, and they knew the humans were desperately scrambling. But if there was even the smallest chance of survival, he wasn't about to sit idly by. "Prepare to fire on my mark," Winters commanded. "Give Hall the time she needs." He turned to Hall, who was already working her console with laser focus. Sweat beaded on her brow as she adjusted the targeting system. The pressure was unbearable, but she could feel something stirring within her. A surge of adrenaline, an almost primal need to protect everything she loved. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for humanity's future. The clock on the screen ticked down. The EMP strike would need to be perfectly timed to hit the heart of the Gaither's communication system, to sever their connection long enough for the humans to exploit the vulnerability. "Ready," Hall whispered under her breath, as she set the ship's weapons to overload in a precise frequency. Her fingers hovered over the trigger. The tension on the bridge was suffocating. The entire crew knew that the next few moments could determine the outcome of the battle and the future of the human race. "Mark," Winters ordered. Hall slammed her palm onto the console, and the ship's cannons fired, sending a concentrated pulse of electromagnetic energy racing toward the Gaither fleet. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, like a ripple in the fabric of reality, the attack hit. The entire Gaither formation flickered. Their ships wavered in their positions, as if the vast intelligence network that connected them all had suddenly been severed. It was as though they had lost their very essence for a moment. The normally synchronized movements of the Gaither fleet became disjointed, their vessels swerving off course in a chaotic, uncoordinated dance. "Hit them now," Winters shouted. The Eclipse wasn't the only ship in the fleet that had been waiting for this moment. A dozen other human vessels, smaller, less advanced, but full of determined men and women, immediately pressed their advantage. Weapons fire exploded from every direction as the human fleet converged on the Gaither vessels. Without their coordinated defense systems, the once imposing Gaither ships became vulnerable. The battle became a blur of motion. Explosions lit up the darkness of space as human ships made calculated strikes, hitting weak points in the Gaither hulls. The enemy's formations faltered, and their once certain dominance began to crumble. But the Gaithers were not known for their patience. Despite their temporary confusion, they quickly began to adapt, responding with brutal efficiency. The Astron, their flagship, fired back with a vengeance, unleashing an energy blast that tore through a nearby human ship, turning it into a mass of molten metal and debris. "We've got incoming," cried out the tactical officer on the Eclipse. "Brace for impact." The entire ship shuddered violently as the shockwave of the Gaither's counterattack slammed into them. The bridge lights flickered and went dark for a moment, plunging the crew into a tense, almost suffocating darkness. Then, with a hiss of emergency systems, the lights flickered back to life. "We're still here," Winters shouted. "We're not backing down. Return fire. Now." The Eclipse launched another barrage, but the Gaither flagship had adjusted, its shields reinforcing in the blink of an eye. It was clear that this was no ordinary battle. The humans were fighting a force that had perfected war itself, fighting against a machine that could adapt faster than they could hope to retaliate. Despite their valiant efforts, the humans' advantage was slipping. The Gaither fleet regained its composure and began pushing back. A massive energy weapon, like a shard of pure destruction, fired from the Astron, slicing through the hull of a nearby human cruiser and obliterating it. The crew of the Eclipse watched helplessly as their comrades died. This wasn't just a military conflict. It was a war of wills, a test of endurance, and humanity was starting to feel the weight of its own limitations. "Admiral," Lieutenant Hall shouted, her voice shaking but filled with determination. "We need to disable their flagship. We can't win this by picking off the smaller ships. We need to cripple the Astron." Winters didn't hesitate. "On it. I want all firepower focused on that flagship. Every weapon we have. Let's make it count." But just as he gave the order, a deep rumble shook the ship. The Eclipse was hit again, this time with a direct strike to their engine room. The entire deck beneath them seemed to buckle, the floor heaving violently as alarms screamed throughout the ship. "We've lost main propulsion," cried out the engineer, his voice frantic. "We're dead in space." The crew felt the weight of the situation settle in. Their flagship, the Eclipse, had been crippled. But Admiral Winters, still standing tall amid the chaos, refused to give in. "No," he growled, his voice low but full of defiance. "We fight. We keep fighting." Without propulsion, they were sitting ducks. But Winters knew something the Gaithers didn't. While their flagship was damaged, their ability to adapt so quickly gave them a critical flaw: complacency. They had grown so used to winning, so certain in their superiority, that they hadn't anticipated a prolonged, desperate fight from their enemies. "Lieutenant Hall," Winters called over, "take your team. Get to the auxiliary weapons control and manually override the targeting systems. We're taking that flagship down, one shot at a time." With determination burning in her eyes, Hall nodded, rallying her crew to the task at hand. The battle had just begun. The last stand. Humanity's resilience. The Eclipse floated, lifeless in the vast expanse of space. The damage was severe, its engines were crippled, and the ship's vital systems flickered erratically. In the wake of the Gaithers' counterattack, it was a miracle that the crew was still alive. Admiral Winters stood in the heart of the chaos, his mind racing. The Eclipse had been their spearhead, their symbol of resistance, but now it was little more than a hulk drifting through the cold dark. Yet even in its dire state, there was no question in his mind. This battle was far from over. The bridge was a battlefield of its own. Crew members moved with purpose, trying to stabilize what they could. Lieutenant Hall, her face covered in sweat and grime, barked orders to the technical team, directing them to restore auxiliary systems. She knew that the key to victory lay not just in the weapons or technology, but in the sheer will to survive. The crew of the Eclipse was still alive, and that meant they still had a chance. "Status report," Winters barked, his voice sharp. "Engines are offline, Admiral." "We're stuck here until we get the power back," the engineer replied, frustration evident in his tone. "Shields are at 35%. It's a miracle they haven't breached us entirely." "Then we'll fight with what we have," Winters responded, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "Prepare all auxiliary weapons. I want every shot aimed at that flagship. Hall, get to the auxiliary weapons control and make sure we can target the Astron manually." Hall gave a quick nod, rallying her team as she darted toward the rear of the ship. She had been in the thick of the fighting from the start, and despite the chaos, she had a plan. She knew that while they had been able to disrupt the Gaithers' fleet temporarily, the true threat lay in their flagship. The Astron was a monstrosity of design and technology, a symbol of the Gaithers' overwhelming superiority. But the Eclipse had one final card to play: its crew's unyielding spirit. As Hall and her team worked feverishly to rewire the targeting systems, Winters turned to the tactical officer. "Get me a direct line to the rest of the fleet. I need every ship to focus on the Astron." The officer nodded, her fingers flying across the console. "Connecting now, Admiral." The comm screen flickered to life, and Winters found himself staring into the eyes of the commanders of the remaining human vessels. Some were in worse shape than the Eclipse, but none of them had surrendered. Admiral Winters, the commander of the Titan, spoke, his voice gravelly from the stress of battle. "We're with you. What's the plan?" "We're going to bring down that flagship, one way or another," Winters said, his gaze hardening. "Every ship in this fleet has suffered, but the Astron is still standing tall. We need to disrupt its power core. Hall's team is working on a way to manually target it. If we can hit their core, the whole ship will destabilize." The fleet commanders exchanged a look. The plan was risky, but it was their only option. "Understood," the commander of the Titan responded. "We'll form a protective perimeter around the Eclipse. You've got one shot at this, Admiral." Winters nodded, closing the comms channel. He turned to the bridge crew. "We don't have much time. Hall will need the window we create for her. Once the Astron is exposed, we'll launch everything we've got. And we will make it count." In the rear of the ship, Hall was working against the clock. The auxiliary control room was a maze of wires, flashing lights, and the constant hum of damaged systems. The team had already rerouted some power to the targeting systems, but there was still a long way to go. Hall's hands moved with precision, disconnecting and reconnecting circuits, adjusting the power flow to the right channels. "We're almost there," she said under her breath, wiping sweat from her brow. "Just a few more minutes, and we'll have manual control over the weapons." Just as she spoke, the ship rocked violently again, the sound of an explosion reverberating throughout the corridors. A direct hit. The Eclipse was taking more damage. "We don't have a few more minutes," one of her crew members shouted. "Keep working." Hall snapped. "We can't stop now." Back on the bridge, Winters felt every second like an eternity. He knew the Eclipse was fading, but there was still hope. The fleet had moved into position, and the Astron, the massive dark vessel that had caused so much destruction, was now in range. It had been nearly invincible up to this point, its shields unbreakable and its weapons devastating. But now it was vulnerable. The Gaithers had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, to push through even the most impossible odds. "Target locked," came Hall's voice over the comms, full of resolve. "We're ready, Admiral. Fire when ready." "All ships, target the Astron's power core," Winters commanded, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere of the bridge. The fleet responded in unison. Cannons fired in a barrage of light and energy, a symphony of destruction. Each ship launched its deadliest weapons, focusing everything they had on the massive Gaither flagship. The Astron tried to react, shifting its shields, but it was too late. The combined power of the human fleet was too much. One by one, the shots found their mark. The Astron's shields flickered and failed, and the first explosion tore through its hull, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. But the flagship did not fall easily. It retaliated with a devastating blast, taking out 2 more human ships in the process. Yet the Gaithers could feel it. Their once impenetrable fortress was beginning to crack. "Keep it up," Winters shouted. "Don't let up. We're this close." Hall watched as the targeting systems locked onto the core. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. She knew this was their moment, their last shot at survival. "On my mark, we fire." The entire fleet held its breath, waiting. The Eclipse's cannons pulsed, charging for the final strike. "Now," Hall cried, slamming her fist down on the console. The Eclipse unleashed its final barrage, a concentrated shot of pure energy, the culmination of everything the crew had fought for. The blast tore through the Astron's core, ripping it apart in a chain reaction that could not be stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the Gaither flagship exploded in a massive burst of light, a shockwave of destruction sending ripples through the battlefield. The remaining Gaither ships, now without their central command, faltered and began to break apart. The tide of the battle had turned. Humanity's resilience, their refusal to back down in the face of impossible odds, had saved them. The Gaither fleet was in disarray. The war was not over, but for the first time, the humans could see victory on the horizon. "We did it," Hall said, her voice full of disbelief as she stared at the wreckage of the Astron. But Winters wasn't celebrating yet. He knew this was just the beginning. They had survived the first wave, but the Gaithers were far from finished. "Prepare for the next phase," he said, his voice grim. "We'll rebuild, and we'll finish this fight." A new hope, rising from the ashes. The battle had ended, but the war was far from over. The Astron's destruction was a blow to the Gaither fleet, but it was only one ship in a vast armada, and the Gaithers would not rest until they reclaimed their dominance. However, for the first time in months, the human fleet had hope. Admiral Winters stood on the bridge of the Eclipse, staring out into the vastness of space. The stars were serene, untouched by the chaos of battle. Yet beneath that calm exterior, there was a palpable tension. The human fleet had survived the Gaithers' first strike, but Winters knew the coming days would test their resilience like never before. The victory they had just won had been won at a high price. Half of the human fleet had been lost, and the Eclipse was crippled, its systems barely holding together. They could not afford to waste any time. "Admiral," Lieutenant Hall called out, her voice a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We've sustained significant damage, but we're not dead in the water yet. We can still make repairs, but we need time." "Time," Winters muttered, as though the word itself carried the weight of 1,000 burdens. "And we don't have much of that." A soft ping echoed across the bridge as a communication link opened. A familiar face appeared on the screen. Commander Rodriguez of the Orion, one of the remaining human ships. He was bruised, bloodied, but alive, as were the survivors of his crew. He had seen the same carnage, felt the same losses, but now his eyes shone with something else. Determination, the same resolve that had carried them through the worst of times. "Admiral Winters," Rodriguez said, his voice steady, "I'm glad to see you're still standing, but we can't rest on our laurels. The Gaithers' reinforcements will be here within days. We need a plan, and we need it fast." Winters nodded. "I agree. We can't afford to wait. We need to hit them before they can regroup." "We've started scanning the Gaither supply lines," Rodriguez continued. "There are several key systems they rely on for resupply and reinforcements. If we can disrupt those, we can weaken their forces significantly before the big push. But we need your fleet to move quickly." "Understood," Winters replied. "Hall, what's the status on repairs?" Hall checked her console and glanced up. "We're patching up what we can, but we need to reroute energy from the remaining operational systems to power up the weaponry. We can't fight without it." Winters took a deep breath, knowing the burden on his crew. They had already been through so much. Every second they spent repairing the Eclipse was another second the Gaithers used to prepare their counterattack. "Do what you can, Hall, but prepare the fleet for a fast strike. We'll hit the Gaither supply lines first." He turned to his communications officer. "Get me a secure channel to the rest of the fleet. I need to coordinate our movements." As the officer worked to establish the connection, Winters' mind raced. The Gaithers had been caught off guard by the Astron's destruction, but they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. They would rebuild, adapt, and come at the humans with everything they had. And the humans, they had only one shot left. This next strike had to count. "Admiral Winters," Hall said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "We've just received a message from Commander Rodriguez's ship. The Gaither fleet is deploying a new type of fighter, something we haven't seen before. It's faster, more agile, and armed with advanced plasma weapons." "Just what we need," Winters muttered, rubbing his eyes. "If the Gaithers are adapting this quickly, we'll need to outthink them, not just outfight them." The communications officer looked up from his console. "Admiral, the fleet is ready for your orders. All ships have confirmed their positions." "All right," Winters said, straightening his posture and turning toward the view of the stars. "We'll hit them fast, and hit them hard. We've taken down their flagship once, and we can do it again. Our strength lies in our numbers, our unity, and the human spirit. We will make them regret ever underestimating us." The Eclipse's engines hummed as it powered up. Hall and her team had managed to get just enough of the ship's systems online to make a move. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The remaining ships of the human fleet, battered but unbroken, readied themselves for the next phase of the battle. There was no turning back now. The first wave of the human fleet surged forward, a determined assault in the dead of space. The Eclipse led the charge, its weapons flaring as it blasted through the void, the human vessels following in its wake. They were on a direct course for the Gaither supply lines, the lifeblood of their war machine. Winters knew that taking down these supply lines would cripple the Gaither forces, depriving them of reinforcements, fuel, and ammunition. If they could take out the supply hubs, the Gaithers would be left stranded, vulnerable. As the human fleet closed in on the first target, an enormous space station floating in the shadow of a nearby gas giant, Hall's voice crackled over the comms. "Admiral, we're picking up new signatures, Gaither fighters incoming. They're faster than anything we've seen before." "Hold steady," Winters commanded, his grip tightening on the rail. "We've trained for this. All ships, prepare to engage." The Gaither fighters appeared on the radar, small, sleek, and deadly. They moved with deadly precision, weaving in and out of the asteroid field surrounding the supply station. The Eclipse fired its remaining weapons, sending bursts of plasma into the cluster of fighters, but the Gaither ships were nimble, dodging and returning fire in a deadly dance. "Incoming fire, shields holding at 60%, Hall shouted as explosions rocked the Eclipse. The ship lurched, but Winters held his ground. He had seen worse. "Deploy countermeasures. All ships, scatter and engage," Winters ordered. The battle erupted into chaos. The human fleet moved in all directions, weaving through the debris of broken ships and missile barrages. Every ship was a target, but the humans were relentless. The Eclipse held its own, its guns firing with precision, taking out several of the Gaither fighters in rapid succession. But for every enemy ship they destroyed, more appeared, each one faster and more aggressive than the last. "We can't keep up," one of the crew members shouted. "Hold the line," Winters barked, his voice full of authority. "We've faced worse. We will not be defeated." Hall gritted her teeth as the Eclipse shook once more. She was at the weapons control, her fingers moving at lightning speed to redirect power to the shields. "I'm rerouting all available power to the aft shields," she said. "We're going to need it if we're going to make it through this." Just as it seemed the Gaither forces would overwhelm them, a new signal blipped on the radar. The fleet commander of the Orion had arrived with reinforcements. A fresh wave of human ships joined the battle, cutting through the Gaither lines and providing much-needed support. "Admiral Winters, we're here. Let's finish this." Commander Rodriguez's voice boomed over the comms. With renewed strength, the human fleet pushed forward. The Gaither fighters faltered, and one by one, the supply stations began to fall. Explosions filled the blackness of space as the Gaithers' carefully constructed supply lines crumbled. But the war was far from over. The Gaithers would regroup. They always did. And as the last supply hub exploded into a spectacular fireball, Winters knew one thing for sure. Humanity's fight was just beginning. The last stand. A war for the future. The aftermath of the battle left the human fleet with a bittersweet victory. The Gaither supply lines had been disrupted, their reinforcements cut off, and their command centers left in disarray. Yet there was no time for celebration. The Gaithers would not forgive this blow easily. Winters knew that they would regroup, adapt, and come at them with everything they had. The human fleet had earned a moment of respite, but the coming storm would require every ounce of courage, every bit of ingenuity, and every shred of resilience they could muster. Admiral Winters stood on the bridge of the Eclipse, staring at the charred remains of the Gaither fleet scattered across the battlefield. The stars in the distance seemed to mock them with their serenity. He could hear the hum of the ship's engines, but the silence in his mind was deafening. The lives they had lost in the past few days were more than just numbers. Each casualty represented a story, a sacrifice made for the future of humanity. And Winters had not forgotten any of them. "Admiral," Lieutenant Hall called out, breaking his reverie. "We've received a communication from command. The Gaithers are preparing for a counteroffensive. They've pulled together a new fleet, larger, faster, and more advanced than anything we've faced before." Winters exhaled slowly. "So, they're finally ready to take us on in full force." "Yes, sir. They've gathered in the Trascan sector, just beyond the outer rim," Hall confirmed. "It's a heavily fortified area. If we're going to stop them, we'll need to strike before they finish reinforcing." Winters paced across the bridge, his mind racing. The Gaithers had regrouped faster than anyone had anticipated. The new fleet was equipped with weapons that humans had never seen before: advanced shields, plasma cannons, and war machines that seemed almost too powerful to be real. But one thing the Gaithers didn't have was the one thing humans had fought for since the beginning of the war: the will to survive, to keep fighting no matter the odds. "Prepare the fleet for a final push," Winters ordered, his voice steady and full of resolve. "We're not just going to defend our home. We're going to take the fight to them. This ends now." The human fleet gathered in the blackness of space, just beyond the reach of the Trascan sector. Winters stood in front of the viewports, watching the ships of the human fleet align themselves in formation. The remaining vessels were battered but still intact, their crews determined, their spirits unbroken. Each of them knew the risk. This would be their last chance to strike before the Gaithers unleashed their full power. "All ships are in position, Admiral," Hall said, her voice calm but heavy with the knowledge of the task ahead. "Good," Winters replied, gripping the edge of his command chair. "Once we engage, there's no turning back. We hit them with everything we've got. No mercy. No hesitation." The Eclipse powered up, its thrusters pushing the ship forward as it began its final approach. The fleet followed in perfect formation, the fleet commanders on the other ships exchanging signals to coordinate their movements. They were no longer just a group of individual ships. They were a united force, bound together by the same purpose. Suddenly, the radar blared with the unmistakable signature of the Gaither fleet. It was massive. Dozens of ships, each one more advanced than the last. The warships glowed ominously in the dark of space, their energy shields flaring to life. The Gaithers had come prepared. "Admiral, we're picking up heavy weapons signatures," Hall reported. "Their fleet is far stronger than anticipated. We may be outgunned. We'll make up for it with speed and precision," Winters said. "Tell the fleet to target their weak points. Engage at full force." The Eclipse surged forward, its weapon systems coming online in a brilliant display of power. The first shots rang out, streaking across the vast emptiness of space. The human fleet opened fire, launching missiles and plasma blasts toward the oncoming Gaither ships. The Gaithers retaliated in kind, their weapons lighting up the dark void as they sent waves of destruction toward the human ships. "Admiral, our shields are holding, but not for long," Hall shouted, her eyes glued to the screens as the battle raged on. The enemy fleet was relentless, but Winters refused to retreat. Every shot they fired, every ship they lost, made them one step closer to victory. He knew that the fate of humanity rested on this moment. If they faltered now, if they gave in to fear or hesitation, everything they had fought for would be lost. But if they pushed forward, if they dug deep and found the strength to survive, they could finally win this war. "Commander Rodriguez, report," Winters called out over the comms. "We're in position, Admiral. We've begun targeting their flank. But the Gaithers are adapting faster than we can anticipate. We've lost 2 ships already. We can't sustain this rate of fire much longer." Winters clenched his fists. We've come too far to fail now. Tell your ships to focus on their engines and weapons. We'll hit them where it hurts." The battle was unfolding at a furious pace. The human fleet was outnumbered, but they fought with a ferocity that the Gaithers had never encountered. The Gaither ships were powerful, their weapons more advanced, but the humans had something they could not replicate: their hearts, their unyielding will, and their unshakable belief in the cause they fought for. In the midst of the chaos, Winters made a decision. If they couldn't win with brute force, they would win with ingenuity. "Lieutenant Hall," he said, turning toward his communications officer, "we need to implement the Astron maneuver. It's our only chance." Hall's eyes widened in realization. The Astron maneuver was a risky tactic, one that relied on timing, precision, and the ability to outthink the enemy. It was a high-stakes move that could destroy both the enemy and the fleet's own ships. But if executed correctly, it would give them the upper hand. "Are you sure, Admiral?" Hall asked, her voice tinged with concern. "We don't have a choice," Winters said, his voice steady. "We do this, or we lose everything." The maneuver was set into motion. The Eclipse and the remaining ships of the human fleet executed a series of rapid evasive maneuvers, drawing the Gaither fleet into a trap. They lured the Gaither ships toward a cluster of asteroids, using the debris as cover while simultaneously launching a flurry of missiles and plasma strikes aimed at the Gaither ships' vital systems. The Gaithers, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tactics, were thrown into disarray. But the Gaithers weren't finished yet. They retaliated fiercely, launching a counterattack that sent shockwaves through space. A massive explosion rocked the Eclipse as a Gaither capital ship fired its main cannon directly at the human flagship. The impact shook the vessel, sending crew members flying, the lights flickering in the chaos. "Damage report," Winters shouted, gripping his seat as the ship groaned under the force of the blast. "Shields are down to 20%, Admiral. The hull is breached," Hall reported, her voice strained but determined. "We can't let up now," Winters commanded. "All ships, press the attack. We end this now." As the battle reached its crescendo, the Eclipse's weapon systems fired with all their remaining power, smashing through the Gaither lines. The human fleet, battered but unbroken, pushed forward, their courage a final desperate charge against the Gaither juggernaut. And then, as if in answer to the prayers of the thousands of men and women aboard the human ships, the Gaither flagship, the heart of their war machine, fell. The blast that destroyed the Gaither capital ship rippled across the battlefield. The enemy forces faltered, their coordination crumbling. One by one, the remaining Gaither ships began to retreat, their shields failing, their weapons silent. "Victory," Winters whispered under his breath, as the smoke of battle slowly began to clear. The fight was over. The Gaithers had been defeated. The war had taken everything from them: friends, family, comrades, and yet humanity had emerged victorious. The cost was unimaginable, but in the end, the human spirit had proven stronger than the forces arrayed against them. Admiral Winters stood on the bridge of the Eclipse, staring at the debris of the Gaither fleet, his heart heavy with the weight of the lives lost. The war was over, but the true work was just beginning. There would be rebuilding, healing, and remembering the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. But one thing was certain: humanity had won, and the stars, once silent and distant, now seemed to shine a little brighter.